Minutes ago. That's the phrase everyone inside palace circles keeps whispering. Not hours. Not days. Minutes. Because whatever line had been holding things together finally snapped, and when it did, the fallout was instant. Here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. What if the royal family didn't just accuse Meghan Markle of betrayal, but decided they were done protecting her altogether? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about that for a second. For years, accusations flew in every direction. Interviews, documentaries, carefully worded statements, tears on camera, silence from the palace. The public was told there were two sides, two truths, two irreconcilable versions of events. But behind closed doors, something very different was happening. Something slow, quiet, methodical. And then, suddenly, it wasn't quiet anymore. According to sources close to the situation, an order came down under King Charles that stunned even seasoned royal staff. Not a rebuttal, not another press briefing. Footage, actual footage, material that had been sealed away, cataloged, and deliberately kept from ever seeing daylight. Why now? That's the part that should make you uneasy. Because institutions like the monarchy don't move impulsively. They don't act out of emotion. They wait. They document. They prepare. And when they act, it's because they believe the consequences of staying silent are worse than the damage of speaking out. So what changed? Here's where the contradictions begin. Publicly, Meghan has framed herself as someone pushed out, stripped of support, denied access. Yet internally, concerns were reportedly growing about money. Not vague expenses, not misunderstandings. Specific figures, specific movements, transfers that raised eyebrows, requests that didn't align with protocol. Ask yourself this. If everything was transparent, why did alarms start ringing? Sources say this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about humiliation. It was about control slipping away. About realizing too late that trust had been extended far beyond what should have been allowed. About the terrifying moment when people inside the palace began asking whether they still understood who had access to what. And then there's Meghan's alleged reaction. Because here's the detail that keeps coming up. When word reached her that footage existed, not rumors, not hearsay, but recorded material, the tone reportedly shifted overnight. Calm statements gave way to frantic calls. Confidence cracked. The narrative tightened. And that alone tells us something mattered deeply. Why fear footage if your story is solid? This story matters now because the palace isn't reacting to the past. It's responding to the present. To pressure. To exposure. To the possibility that letting this continue unchecked could threaten more than reputations. And the introduction ends where things truly get dangerous. Because the most shocking part isn't what the footage allegedly shows. It's who finally said, release it. And once that decision was made, the chain reaction began. The first warning sign didn't come with sirens. It came with silence. No press leaks. No friendly briefings. No subtle counter-narratives slipped to sympathetic journalists. Instead, something far more unsettling happened inside palace walls. Meetings multiplied. Doors closed. Phones stopped ringing the way they used to. And people who had spent decades navigating royal crises began exchanging the same uneasy look. Have you ever seen an institution go quiet right before it moves? According to insiders, the tension reached a breaking point during what was supposed to be a routine internal review. Nothing dramatic. Just numbers. Just paperwork. Just one more look at accounts that had already been looked at before. Except this time, the numbers didn't behave. Totals didn't align. Explanations felt rehearsed. And the phrase, temporary arrangement, appeared one too many times. That's when the mood shifted. This wasn't about a single transfer or an innocent oversight. It was about a pattern, a growing sense that boundaries had been stretched, then bent, and possibly crossed. All while the public narrative painted a very different picture. Here's the contradiction no one could ignore anymore. How does someone claim exclusion while allegedly exercising financial access? How does someone portray themselves as powerless while quietly moving through systems built on trust? These questions reportedly triggered emergency conversations at the highest levels. Advisors split into camps. Some argued silence was still safer. Others warned that silence had become dangerous. And hovering over every discussion was one unspoken fear. What if this comes out another way? Because leaks don't always favor the people who wait. Then came the moment insiders now refer to as the snap. A late-night meeting, a folder reopened, and a realization that changed the entire strategy. The palace didn't just have documents. It had footage, visual records that contextualized behavior, intent, and attitude, not just numbers on a page. This wasn't supposed to exist. Or rather, it was supposed to stay buried. Imagine the shock. Years spent carefully crafting public distance, only to realize that internal records told a far more complicated story. A story that, if released selectively by someone else, could spiral completely out of control. That's when the word containment entered the conversation. Not punishment, not retaliation, containment. One advisor reportedly said something chilling. Once trust is gone, control becomes the priority. And for the first time, silence no longer felt like control. It felt like surrender. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, something else was happening. Calls allegedly went unanswered. Messages followed up too quickly. The confidence that once defined public appearances began to crack behind the scenes. Because when you know evidence exists, you don't wait calmly for it to surface. You prepare, or you panic. And the palace noticed. What pushed everything over the edge wasn't anger. It was the realization that if they didn't act first, someone else might. And when institutions lose control of timing, they lose everything else with it. So a decision was made. Not lightly, not unanimously, but decisively. The footage would no longer remain sealed. And that's when investigators reportedly followed the trail even further, beyond meetings, beyond explanations, straight into the money itself. Because once they asked where it went, they weren't prepared for where it led. Here's the part no one likes talking about. Because once you follow the money, the story stops being emotional and starts becoming dangerous. It always begins the same way. On paper, everything looks reasonable. Clean lines. Approved categories. Vague descriptions that sound official enough to avoid scrutiny. Administrative language that smooths over sharp edges. But investigators are trained to notice what doesn't scream for attention. And in this case, what stood out most was how ordinary everything tried to look. Ask yourself this. If nothing improper happened, why did the explanations keep changing? According to those familiar with the review, the first few discoveries were brushed off as clerical issues. A delay here. A reclassification there. Money moving, temporarily, for reasons no one could fully articulate anymore. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one is watching closely. Then came the contradictions. Funds that were said to be inaccessible appeared to have been accessed. Accounts described as restricted showed activity. And transfers that supposedly required multiple approvals seemed to move with unsettling ease. Not fast enough to trigger alarms. Just quietly enough to blend in. This is where the irony turns brutal. The same institution accused of suffocating control was now scrambling to understand how control had slipped. The same system portrayed as rigid and cold had apparently trusted too much, too freely, too long. And that trust, investigators feared, may have been used against it. One source described the moment it clicked like this. Once you see one inconsistency, you assume it's an exception. When you see three, you start asking questions. When you see a pattern, you stop giving the benefit of the doubt. And there was a pattern. What made it worse was the involvement of intermediaries. People who weren't supposed to be central, yet appeared repeatedly. Names that surfaced across unrelated documents. Entities that seemed to act as buffers between origin and destination. Enough distance to blur accountability. Not enough to disappear completely. So let me ask you something uncomfortable. Is that how transparency looks? Because here's the detail that reportedly set off alarms inside the palace. Some funds appeared to change purpose midstream. Allocations designated for one thing ending up categorized as another. Not illegal on its face, but deeply questionable when viewed as a whole. And this is where the footage becomes crucial. Because numbers can be argued. Paper can be reinterpreted. But behavior? Tone? Intent captured in real time? That's harder to spin. Investigators began cross-referencing timelines. Transfers aligned with moments caught on camera. Conversations overlapped with financial activity. And suddenly, what once looked circumstantial began forming a narrative the palace couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, pressure mounted externally. Public sympathy remained high. Media narratives stayed fixed. And yet internally, the sense grew that the longer this stayed hidden, the more explosive it would become. That's when the question shifted. Not did something improper happen, but what happens if this footage is released by someone else first? Because at that point, control would be gone. Permanently. And just as that realization set in, analysts reached the most unsettling discovery yet. The footage didn't just show transactions being discussed. It showed confidence, comfort, a sense of ownership no one expected to see. And that's when everything stopped being theoretical. Because once behavior entered the equation, the palace knew the next step would change the entire narrative, and there would be no walking it back. Here's the moment everything shifted. Not with an announcement, not with a headline, but with a screen lighting up in a quiet room where no one was speaking anymore. Because once the footage started playing, the argument stopped. This wasn't grainy security tape or contextless clips stitched together to tell a story. According to those who saw it, the footage was calm, clear, almost casual, and that's exactly why it landed like a punch to the chest. There was no panic in the voice captured, no confusion, no hesitation. What it showed instead was comfort, familiarity, a tone that suggested this wasn't unusual at all. Ask yourself this. How does someone sound when they believe they're untouchable? That's what reportedly shook palace officials the most. Not anger, not defiance, but confidence. The kind that only comes from thinking rules don't apply, from believing access is permanent, from assuming no one will ever challenge it. The footage allegedly captured moments that contradicted years of public messaging. The victim narrative clashed with what appeared to be authority behind the scenes. Requests weren't framed as pleas. They were framed as expectations, instructions, assumptions that systems would bend because they always had before. And here's where the emotional weight really hit. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about trust. About realizing that the institution had been portrayed one way to the world while being treated very differently in private. And once that realization set in, the question inside the room changed again. How long had this been happening? Because the footage didn't feel like a one-off. It felt practiced, like someone who knew exactly which doors opened, which names carried weight, and which phrases made things move faster. And that frightened people who thought they understood every vulnerability of the system they worked for. Now picture King Charles being briefed. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but clinically, frame by frame, timeline by timeline. Each clip placed next to financial movements already under review. Each interaction adding context no spreadsheet ever could. This is where timing becomes everything. Why release this now? Because waiting any longer risked losing control of the narrative entirely. Because internal confidence had eroded. Because the footage, once seen, could never be unseen. And because the longer it stayed hidden, the more it looked like complicity. That's the part no one wanted to face. So approval was given. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, quietly, with an understanding that once this crossed the threshold into public space, there would be no reset, no clarification tour, no apology big enough to undo it. And on the other side, reaction was swift. Calls allegedly escalated. Statements tightened. Language hardened. What once sounded assured began sounding defensive. Because when footage exists, words alone stop being enough. Here's the final question for this chapter. If your story is true, why does evidence feel like a threat? Because once the footage went public, the narrative didn't just wobble. It fractured. And what followed next wasn't damage control. It was something far more revealing. A response so explosive it forced everyone to ask whether the fallout was only just beginning. So now we circle back to the question that started all of this. What if the silence was never weakness, but preparation? Because once the footage surfaced, something irreversible happened. The story stopped belonging to interviews, to documentaries, to carefully framed sound bites. It stopped being about who spoke louder or cried harder. It became about contrast, about receipts versus rhetoric, about what people say when they know cameras are rolling, and how differently they move when they think no one is watching. And that's the part that lingers. The palace didn't rush to celebrate. There were no victory laps, no smug briefings. If anything, the reaction was restrained, almost somber. Because this wasn't a win. It was an admission that something had gone wrong long before the footage ever existed. That trust had been extended too far. That lines had blurred in ways no institution can afford. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Once control of the narrative was lost, it could never be fully recovered. For Meghan, the impact wasn't just reputational. It was structural. The confidence that once powered her public persona suddenly collided with evidence that didn't need interpretation. And when that happens, emotion takes over. Defensiveness replaces certainty. Statements become sharper. Silences grow louder. Ask yourself this. Why does accountability feel like persecution to some people and relief to others? Because the reaction told a story of its own. Not just anger, but urgency. Not just denial, but speed. As if time itself had become the enemy. And that's rarely the posture of someone who feels secure. For King Charles, this moment marked something else entirely. A shift from endurance to enforcement. From protecting the institution's image to protecting its integrity. The footage wasn't released to humiliate. It was released to draw a line. To say this is where access ends. This is where narratives stop overriding records. And yet, this isn't closure. It's an opening. Because footage doesn't exist in isolation. Reviews don't stop with one discovery. And once an institution admits it misjudged trust, it rarely stops asking where else it might have been misplaced. That's what makes this moment so significant. Not what's already been seen, but what might still be reviewed. So here's the final thought to sit with. When someone builds their power on the belief that no one will ever challenge them, the real shock isn't exposure. It's realization. The realization that protection was conditional. That access was borrowed. That the system they thought they outsmarted was simply waiting. And now the waiting is over. If you want to understand what happens next, legally, financially, personally, this story isn't finished. It's evolving. And every move from here forward will be shaped by one undeniable fact. Once evidence speaks, stories must answer to it. If this revelation changed how you see the entire situation, make sure you stay close. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who still thinks this was just a media feud. And comment below, what part of this story made you stop and rethink everything? Because when a palace breaks its silence, it's never without reason.